Have you ever found yourself saying, "I'll be happy when I finally land that dream job, when I buy my first house, when I fall in love with the right person, when I travel to that faraway country I've always wanted to see." And then when that day comes, it feels good. For a while, you celebrate, you feel on top of the world, but soon enough the excitement fades. And without even realizing it, you start chasing the next thing. Another goal, another milestone, another win. It's strange, isn't it? How happiness always seems to be dangling just out of reach, like a mirage in the distance, shimmering, beautiful, and forever moving away as you draw near. Why is that? Why do we never feel happy enough, no matter how much we achieve? Maybe it's because, somewhere along the way, we were taught to believe that happiness is a destination, a final prize waiting at the end of a long, hard road, something we earn after we've sacrificed, struggled, and proved ourselves worthy. But what if that's a lie? What if the very idea of chasing happiness is the very thing keeping us from ever truly feeling it? There's a beautiful teaching from a gentle, humble monk who touched millions with his wisdom, Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh. He said, "There is no way to happiness. Happiness is the way." At first, those words might sound simple, maybe even poetic, but hidden within them is a truth so profound. It has the power to change the way we live. Because if happiness isn't a distant prize, if it isn't waiting for us in some perfect version of the future, then where is it? The answer is both humbling and liberating. It's here, right now, in this breath you're taking, in the warmth of sunlight on your skin, in the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, in the quiet of your morning coffee, in the familiar laugh of a loved one. The problem is, most of us are too busy chasing life to notice that life is already happening. From the moment we wake up, our minds leap ahead. What's next on my to-do list? What will I eat for lunch? Will this meeting go well? When can I finally take that vacation? And while we run toward a future that never arrives, we miss the 1,000 tiny moments that were quietly offering us peace. This endless pursuit of more is a deep groove in the human mind, a pattern as old as time. The ancient texts of Buddhism called it T, a letter 1e47ha macron, craving, thirst, longing. It's the relentless wanting that fuels our suffering, not because wanting is inherently bad, but because when our happiness depends on what we don't yet have, we've already sentenced ourselves to restlessness. A famous parable tells of a man who spends his whole life searching for a magical gem, rumored to grant eternal happiness. He crosses oceans, scales mountains, and braves countless dangers. Finally, exhausted and broken, he collapses beneath a tree. As he lays there, defeated, he notices a single dewdrop catching the morning light, shimmering like a tiny diamond. In that still moment, he feels an unexplainable peace, not because he found the gem, but because, for the first time, he stopped chasing. This is what Thich Nhat Hanh meant. Happiness isn't something you arrive at. It's something you walk with. It's not hiding in the future. It's living quietly in the present, waiting for you to notice. But we weren't taught to see it that way. Society rewards achievement. Schools train us to set goals, chase after grades, pursue promotions. Advertisements whisper that we need more, better clothes, newer gadgets, grander vacations. The world convinces us that happiness lives just one step beyond where we are. And so we run, and run, and run, rarely stopping to ask ourselves, what am I really chasing? Is it love? Is it peace? Is it validation? Or is it the illusion that if I can just check off one more box on life's list, I'll finally feel okay? The irony is, even when we arrive at our destination, we often feel strangely empty, like eating a meal you've craved for hours, only to find it wasn't as satisfying as you imagined. Because the truth is, happiness wasn't waiting at the finish line. It was scattered along the path you hurried past. And maybe, if we learned to slow down, if we trained ourselves to notice the coolness of the morning air, the steady rhythm of our breath, the quiet miracle of simply being alive, we might discover that happiness was never missing. It was never lost. It was never late. It was simply waiting for us to remember it. So here's a quiet invitation. Before you chase the next thing, before you tell yourself that you'll be happy when you're thinner, richer, braver, smarter, or more successful, pause, look around, breathe, listen. Because this right here, right now is your life. And this life in all its imperfection and unpredictability is where happiness lives. It isn't about perfection. It isn't about arrival. It's about presence. And the beautiful thing about presence is that it's always available. You don't have to wait for it. You don't have to earn it. You just have to choose it. In the quiet spaces of your ordinary days, you might just find the extraordinary. And once you realize that, once you begin to sense the subtle joy in simple things, the chase will lose its power over you. Because when you're truly here, fully awake to this moment, you'll understand happiness was never a place to get to. It was always the way. There's a wisdom to this ancient teaching. And if you've ever felt the ache of running after something that never quite filled you, maybe it's time to stop, to see, to breathe, to be. And somewhere in that stillness, you'll sense the faint glimmer of peace you've been chasing your entire life. It's one of the oldest stories we tell ourselves, that happiness lives at the end of a road paved with hard work, sacrifices, and carefully executed plans. One day, when I have it all figured out, I'll finally be happy. But here's a question no one asks enough. Where exactly is there? And why does it always seem to move the closer we get? Most of us are living inside a myth, the myth of destination happiness. A story that says our joy is something waiting for us in the future, just beyond the next achievement, the next promotion, the next relationship, the next version of ourselves. We've been sold a dream of arrival, but what we're chasing isn't real. You see, happiness isn't like a treasure chest buried on some distant shore. It isn't a trophy at the end of a race, and it certainly isn't a state you enter and stay in forever. Yet the world whispers otherwise. From the moment we're young, we're conditioned to believe, work hard now, be happy later. Sacrifice today for a better tomorrow. Delay pleasure, endure stress, keep grinding because someday it'll all pay off. And so we obey. We chase grades, we hustle for promotions, we buy the house, we plan the perfect wedding, we count followers, dollars, trophies, milestones. And yet, every time we arrive at a destination we thought would complete us, we realize it doesn't. The satisfaction is temporary, a burst of euphoria quickly followed by a subtle emptiness. And before we can even process that feeling, the mind fixates on a new target, a new when, a new if only. It's like running on a treadmill, believing that with enough effort you'll reach the horizon you see in front of you. But no matter how fast you run, the scenery never changes. Buddhist philosophy has a word for this: samsara, the endless cycle of craving and suffering, of chasing illusions, believing they'll save us, only to find ourselves trapped in the same old patterns. The Buddha taught that suffering isn't caused by life itself, but by the clinging mind, by our relentless attachment to outcomes, to labels, to identities, to the belief that our worth depends on external circumstances aligning just right. And in modern life, this illusion takes on 1,000 forms. I'll be happy when I lose 20 pounds, when I find the right partner, when I finally travel to Bali, when I'm debt-free, when I get 100,000 subscribers. But what we're really chasing isn't those things. We're chasing a feeling, a sense of enoughness, a quiet, steady peace inside. And here's the paradox. That peace doesn't live in the future. It lives in your relationship with this very moment. Because the truth is, no destination can guarantee lasting happiness. Life will always be life. Messy, unpredictable, full of unexpected turns, losses, and surprises. Even when you get the thing you wanted most. Life keeps moving. New challenges appear. Old wounds resurface. The mind invents new desires. Zen teachings compare it to drinking salty water. The more you consume, the thirstier you become. And unless we wake up to this illusion, we'll spend our lives chasing mirages. There's a powerful story from the Buddhist tradition about a merchant who spent decades searching for a rare and precious jewel. He believed that once he found it, his suffering would end. One day, exhausted and heartbroken after years of searching, he stopped by a river to rest. There, an old monk offered him a simple cup of tea. The merchant poured out his pain, his failures, his endless search. The monk listened quietly, then pointed to the rippling surface of the water and said, "Do you see how the river never clings to a single shape, yet it keeps flowing?" The merchant nodded. "Happiness is like that," the monk smiled. "It isn't something to possess, it's something to move with." And in that moment, the merchant realized he'd spent his life chasing a thing, when what he truly longed for was a way of being. That is the illusion of destination happiness. It promises peace while keeping it just out of reach. It teaches us to postpone joy, to defer presence, to trade the richness of now for the fantasy of later. But what if the real wisdom is learning to find contentment here, within the imperfect, ordinary, and unpredictable moments that make up our days? What if instead of chasing a better life, we learn to build a better relationship with life as it is? Because here's a secret, no matter where you go, you'll still be there, with your same restless mind, your same old patterns, unless you choose to wake up to them. That's the invitation Buddhist wisdom offers, not to reject goals or ambitions, not to abandon dreams, but to see them for what they are, beautiful, fleeting experiences, not ultimate destinations. And once you see through the illusion, something remarkable happens. You begin to savor the journey itself. You notice small joys you once sped past, a kind word, a beautiful sunrise, the quiet hum of your breath at night. The chase loses its grip on you, and in its place, a deeper kind of happiness begins to bloom, one not tied to outcomes but rooted in awareness. Because the truth is, there is no perfect arrival, and there never needed to be. There's only this breath, this moment, and within it the quiet miracle of being alive. And as we open our eyes to that truth, as we loosen our grip on the endless chase, we might finally discover the kind of peace that was never meant to be pursued, only embraced. Somewhere along the way, we've forgotten how to simply be. We've been so busy chasing life's milestones, ticking off to-do lists, and racing towards some imagined finish line, that we've overlooked the only place happiness has ever truly existed. Right here, right now, the present moment. But for most of us, this moment feels like a waiting room, something to get through on our way to somewhere better. We eat while scrolling through our phones. We listen but don't really hear. We breathe, but rarely notice the rise and fall of our own chest. And then we wonder why peace feels so distant. The ancient masters weren't strangers to this dilemma. They knew the restless mind's tendency to wander, to cling, to resist. That's why Buddhist teachings return again and again to one simple, powerful practice: mindfulness. Not as a trendy technique, not as a quick fix, but as a way of being. Mindfulness means fully inhabiting this moment, with your whole body, your full attention, and an open, compassionate heart. It's not about controlling your thoughts or forcing yourself to feel good. It's about noticing, without judgment, what's already here. the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the subtle flavor of your morning tea, the steady rhythm of your own breathing. These things, so small, so ordinary, hold a kind of quiet magic. But we miss them when we're caught in yesterday's regrets or tomorrow's worries. The Buddha once compared the mind to a wild monkey, leaping from branch to branch, restless, never still. And unless we learn to gently train it, that monkey mind will keep pulling us away from our lives, one distraction at a time. But here's the beautiful truth. You don't have to fix your whole life to feel joy. You don't need perfect circumstances. You don't have to wait for the world to settle down. Happiness begins in the smallest acts of attention, in the way you notice the cool air on your face, the texture of a stone in your hand, the softness in your grandmother's voice, and those brief moments of awareness. Those are life, not the future vacation, not the promotion, not the someday when everything finally makes sense, but this breath, this heartbeat, this now. Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh once said, "The present moment is filled with joy and happiness. If you are attentive, you will see it." Most of us aren't unhappy because we lack joy. We're unhappy because we've lost the capacity to notice it. A deep practice of mindfulness invites you to rediscover that capacity, to wake up from autopilot, to come home to yourself. It doesn't mean your problems disappear. It doesn't mean life stops being complicated. It means you stop waiting for a perfect moment to feel alive. There's a beautiful story of a Zen student who asked his master, "What is enlightenment?" The master smiled and replied, "When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep." Simple, ordinary, unremarkable. But how often do we truly do these things, without a phone in our hand, without a mind racing ahead to what's next, without wishing we were somewhere else? Mindfulness is an invitation to slow down. Not to escape life, but to fully enter it. To feel your feet on the ground when you walk. To taste your food as though it were the first time. To listen to your child's laughter, not as background noise, but as a sacred moment. And slowly you'll notice something remarkable. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The way sunlight spills across your kitchen counter in the morning. The sound of rain tapping against your window. The scent of earth after a storm. These small, easily overlooked details carry the texture of life's beauty. And when you're present for them, your sense of separation from the world softens. You're no longer a distant observer, waiting for happiness to arrive. You're participating in the quiet miracle of existence. It's a practice. Some days you'll forget. You'll get swept up in worries, deadlines, frustrations. But every breath is an opportunity to return, to begin again, not because you're broken, not because you need fixing, but because you deserve to experience the fullness of being alive. And the astonishing thing is, the more you practice mindfulness, the more joy seems to appear, not from the outside, but from within. Like a flower blooming in a neglected garden, like a song you forgot you knew. It was always there. You just stopped listening. So pause for a moment now. Notice your breath. Feel the weight of your body wherever you're sitting. Let the sounds around you arrive without resistance. You don't have to label them. You don't have to change them. Just be here. This is it. This is life. And it's quietly, breathtakingly beautiful. As we continue this journey together, we'll discover how mindfulness isn't just a practice. It's a gateway, a portal to a deeper kind of happiness, one not based on conditions, but on awareness itself. And in embracing that awareness, we move one step closer to remembering what was never truly lost. There's a silent heaviness we all carry, a weight made of expectations, regrets, grudges, fears, and stories about who we're supposed to be. Most of us don't even realize we're holding it, but it shapes the way we move through the world. It tightens our chest when someone disappoints us. It stirs restlessness when life doesn't unfold the way we planned. It whispers that we're not enough, not yet, not until. And so we cling to ideas, to people, to outcomes, to a version of ourselves that feels safe, even if it's suffocating. But what if the peace we long for isn't something to gain, but something to release? The ancient wisdom of Buddhism has always pointed to this truth. Suffering doesn't come from what happens to us. It comes from our attachment to how we think things should be. A mind that clings is a mind in chains, and the key to those chains is letting go, not as a dramatic, reckless act, not as giving up, but as a gentle, courageous surrender to what is. Letting go isn't about not caring. It's about caring deeply while releasing the need to control. It's choosing to stop gripping the rope that's burning your hands. It's allowing life to unfold on its own strange, beautiful terms. There's an old Zen story of two monks traveling together. They came to a river where a young woman waited, unable to cross. One monk in silence lifted her onto his back, carried her across, and set her down. The two monks continued walking for hours. Finally, the other monk couldn't hold his tongue. "You know we're not supposed to touch women," he said. "Why did you carry her?" The first monk smiled gently. "I put her down hours ago," he replied. "Why are you still carrying her?" And isn't that exactly what we do? Carry moments long after they've passed. Replay conversations in our heads. Hold on to slights, mistakes, old hurts as if keeping them alive will somehow make us feel better. But it never does. It just weighs us down. Real peace comes the moment we decide to loosen our grip, to unclench our fists around the things we cannot control. It's in forgiving someone, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace. It's in releasing a plan you've outgrown. It's in accepting the truth of this moment, even if it wasn't the one you imagined. And what's astonishing is how light life feels when you do. When you stop dragging the past behind you like a bag of stones, suddenly there's space for breath, for joy, for quiet moments of wonder you'd overlooked while you were busy gripping tightly to your expectations. Letting go doesn't mean erasing your story. It means no longer being held hostage by it. It means you can love someone and still release them. You can grieve and still choose joy. You can hold memories without letting them hold you. And in that space, something miraculous happens. You come home to yourself, not the version molded by fear or expectation, but the quiet, steady presence that was there all along. The Buddhists call it non-attachment, not cold detachment, not indifference, but a state of openness where you experience life fully without clinging or resisting, like holding water in your hands. If you grip too tightly, it slips through your fingers, but if you hold it gently, it stays. Life is like that too. The more tightly you cling, the more you suffer. The more gently you hold it, the more it reveals its beauty. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "Letting go gives us freedom, and freedom is the only condition for happiness." So ask yourself, what are you still carrying? What story, what resentment, what fear has overstayed its welcome in your heart? And what might it feel like to set it down, not all at once, not forever, but just for now? Take a breath. Notice the tightness in your body, the weight in your chest, the grip in your thoughts, and with each exhale, soften. You don't have to fix everything today. You don't have to have all the answers. You only have to be here. And in that presence, the letting go happens naturally, like leaves falling from a tree in autumn, not forced, not mourned, just part of the beautiful, inevitable rhythm of life. And when you learn to trust that rhythm, to release what no longer serves you, you discover something deeper than fleeting happiness. You uncover the steady, unshakable peace that's been waiting beneath it all. And as we move forward, this understanding becomes a doorway. Because once we begin letting go, what naturally follows is something even more extraordinary: the ability to rediscover joy in the simplest, most unexpected places. We've been taught to chase happiness, as if it's some trophy waiting at the end of a long, winding road. We believe that if we work hard enough, achieve enough, endure long enough, happiness will be our prize. But the truth is far more beautiful and far more confronting. Happiness isn't a reward you get someday. It's a practice, a daily, deliberate, moment-by-moment practice. And like any meaningful practice, it's messy. It's imperfect. It's filled with days you don't feel like showing up, and days when you surprise yourself with quiet joy in the simplest of things. The great Buddhist teacher Shantideva once said, "We are what we practice. If you practice bitterness, you become bitter. If you practice kindness, you become kind. If you practice presence, you become present. And if you practice happiness, not as a fleeting emotion, but as a way of relating to life, you become happy." Not the Instagram perfect kind, not the endless laughter, tropical vacations, or picture-perfect relationships, but the grounded, unshakable, peaceful kind. The kind of happiness that breathes beneath sorrow, that quietly sits beside grief, that isn't thrown by a bad day or a missed opportunity. And here's where it gets interesting. Most people think happiness happens when life aligns perfectly, but life rarely does. People disappoint. Plans unravel. Health falters. Dreams shift. Yet amidst it all, the ones who seem truly content are those who treat happiness not as an outcome, but as a way of walking through the world. They savor a morning cup of tea. They notice the warmth of sunlight on their skin. They find humor in the absurdity of it all. They show up to their own lives with tenderness, not because everything is perfect, but because they've made peace with the imperfection. Happiness, real happiness, is a skill. It's the ability to return to the present moment, no matter how ordinary or messy, and whisper, "There's beauty here too." It's choosing, again and again, to notice what's good, to give thanks for what's working, to allow yourself to feel joy even when the world feels heavy. And it's cultivated the same way you'd nurture a garden, with patience, with attention, with acceptance that some days will bloom and others will wither. No one becomes joyful by accident. It's something you practice, in how you speak to yourself, in what you pay attention to, in how you treat strangers, in how you show up for the ones you love. There's a reason Buddhist monks, who own nothing and live the simplest of lives, often radiate a kind of contagious, gentle joy, because they've spent years practicing it. Not through grand gestures, but through thousands of tiny moments of mindfulness. They smile at the sound of rain on the roof. They notice the color of leaves in autumn. They bow in gratitude before a simple bowl of rice. And you don't have to shave your head or retreat to a monastery to live this way. You can begin right now. What if, for today, you practiced noticing one thing you're grateful for? What if you spoke to yourself the way you would a dear friend? What if you let yourself laugh at something silly? What if you paused for just a moment to feel your breath moving in and out of your chest, the miracle of it? And what if you did that not to earn happiness, but because in those small, sacred moments, happiness is already here? There's a powerful line from the Zen teacher Charlotte Joko Beck. Our life is like an onion. You peel it off one layer at a time, and sometimes you weep. But if you stay with it, through the tears, through the laughter, through the uncertainty, you discover that each layer holds its own quiet, complicated beauty. And the practice is simply to stay, to show up, to notice, to soften, not to force yourself to feel good, but to gently meet life as it is. Because happiness isn't the destination waiting at the end of your suffering. It's the warmth of the sun on your back as you walk through it. And the beautiful paradox is, the more you practice noticing joy in small, ordinary things, the more extraordinary your life begins to feel. So ask yourself, what tiny joy have you overlooked today? What moment of beauty passed you by while you were waiting for the real happiness to arrive? Maybe it was the softness of your pillow this morning, the sound of wind through the trees, a text from a friend, a shared smile with a stranger. The practice is to catch it, to name it, to let it in, not as a reward, but as a birthright, as a way of being. And as you do, you'll begin to feel something shift, a quiet contentment settling in. Not because life is easier, but because you've changed how you meet it. And that is the real practice. Now, as we continue forward, let's open the door to something even deeper. The idea that true joy lives not in what you add to your life, but in what you let go of. A beautiful paradox will quietly unravel next. There's a quiet truth life has been whispering to us since the very beginning. A truth we often resist, deny, or try to outrun. But it lingers in the background of every moment, whether we acknowledge it or not. Nothing lasts forever. The people we love, the seasons we savor, the roles we play, the joys we chase, the pains we endure, all of it in time will change. And yet, so much of our suffering is born from pretending otherwise. We hold on tightly to what's meant to pass. We brace against inevitable endings. We mourn the loss of things before they've even slipped through our fingers. Buddhism has a word for this, anicca, the truth of impermanence. It's not a threat. It's not a punishment. It's the natural rhythm of life, like the rise and fall of the ocean's tides, the waxing and waning of the moon, the bloom and decay of flowers. Everything that comes into being will, in time, dissolve. And rather than fearing this, what if we learn to befriend it? There's a profound freedom in embracing life's impermanence. When you stop clinging, you start living. When you stop expecting things to stay, you begin to savor them more fully while they're here. Imagine holding a beautiful, delicate butterfly in your hands. You know you can't keep it. Its wings are too fragile, its nature too wild. And so, you admire it while it rests, and then when the time comes, you let it go. Not in despair, but with gratitude for the moment it chose to land in your life. That's how happiness works too. It comes and it goes. Sometimes quietly, sometimes in bursts of joy. And our work isn't to trap it, but to welcome it when it arrives and bow when it leaves. When you understand impermanence, not just in your mind, but in your bones, something shifts. Suddenly, small irritations lose their grip. Petty arguments feel less urgent. You stop postponing joy for some perfect future moment, because you realize this moment is all you're guaranteed. A Zen proverb reminds us, "This too shall pass." It's not just a balm for hard times. It's a call to cherish the good while it lasts, to drink in the sweetness of a sunset, knowing night will follow, to hug your loved ones a little tighter, knowing none of us are promised tomorrow. This awareness doesn't make life sadder. It makes it precious. It reminds you that every ordinary morning is a miracle, that every shared laugh, every breath of fresh air, every lingering gaze is an unrepeatable moment in time. Not something to be overlooked or taken for granted, but something to be held tenderly. And here's the quiet gift hidden in impermanence. Because everything changes, so too can your pain, your grief, your loneliness, your self-doubt. Nothing you feel is permanent. No storm, no sorrow, no regret. As surely as winter melts into spring, so too will your darkest seasons soften into something new. That's the mercy of impermanence. It means nothing bad lasts forever. And nothing good is wasted, because every fleeting moment shapes the next. The Buddhists don't teach this to make us fearful, but to awaken us, to invite us to stop sleepwalking through our lives, to stop waiting for perfect conditions, to stop clinging to what's gone and fearing what's ahead, and instead to be here, now, to let things be as they are, to meet each moment with openness, knowing it will pass, to savor each beauty, knowing it's temporary. Because in the space where we release our grip, where we stop chasing, we finally feel the quiet joy of simply being alive. It's the sound of rain at night, the warmth of a hand in yours, the ache of a goodbye softened by the sweetness of having loved it all. Impermanence is life's way of keeping us humble. It reminds us we are guests here, passing through. And while we're here, perhaps our task isn't to accumulate more or to secure what cannot be secured, but to soften, to savor, and to live awake. So tonight or tomorrow, when you find yourself frustrated, impatient, or afraid, pause and whisper gently to yourself, "This too shall pass." And let it be a reminder not of loss, but of life's beautiful, fleeting brilliance. Because if you can hold this truth close, you'll realize something extraordinary. The secret to happiness was never in securing more, but in learning to let go with grace. And now, with this wisdom quietly settling in our hearts, we arrive at the final, most tender chapter of all, a simple, powerful truth you've known deep down your whole life. A truth worth remembering every single day. So here we are, not at the end of a road, but at the start of a new one. You see, all along, we've been taught to believe happiness was a destination, a prize you claim once the world finally arranges itself in your favor. Once you're richer, thinner, loved, safe. Once you've fixed your flaws, outrun your fears, gathered enough, achieved enough, become enough. But every step along this path has shown us otherwise. The endless chase, the mirage of destination happiness, the quiet power of the present moment, the art of letting go, the wisdom of impermanence. They've all been gentle signs pointing to a single, undeniable truth. There is no way to happiness. Happiness is the way. It's not something waiting for you at the finish line. It's the way you choose to walk through your life moment by moment. It's in the pause between heartbeats, in the quiet sip of morning tea, in the laughter shared with someone you love, even when the world feels uncertain, in the simple decision to breathe deeply instead of rushing past yourself. Happiness isn't out there, it's here, now. And not the flashy, perfect, picture book kind of happiness, but the real, weathered, beautifully imperfect kind. The kind that makes room for both joy and sorrow, for both sunrises and storms, for both beginnings and inevitable endings. The Buddha never promised a life without difficulty. What he offered was a way to suffer less, to stop adding weight to what we already carry, to meet life on its own terms with clarity, compassion, and a heart steady enough to hold both the beauty and the ache of being human. And in doing so, to discover that the peace we long for isn't waiting on the other side of perfect conditions. It blooms quietly in the middle of ordinary days, when you stop chasing and start noticing, when you stop clinging and start trusting, when you stop wishing for a different life and start loving the one unfolding in front of you. This isn't a theory, it's a practice, a daily, moment-to-moment decision to choose presence over distraction, gratitude over complaint, kindness over cynicism, enough over never enough. And yes, you'll forget. You'll get caught up again in the noise, the fear, the endless wanting. But that's okay, because every breath offers a new beginning. Every sunrise carries a silent invitation. Begin again. This is the new way of living. Not a life free of pain, but a life no longer ruled by it. Not a happiness dependent on what happens, but one born from how you meet whatever happens. A life where happiness isn't the goal you're chasing, but the path you're walking. Right now, barefoot, imperfect, open-hearted, because in the end, all we ever truly have is this moment. And in this moment, you have a choice to keep running or to stop, to wake up, to look around, to let the ordinary become sacred, to let your very existence, fragile, fleeting, miraculous, be enough. And if you do, you'll realize the great secret was never hidden. It was here all along, softly waiting for you to remember. happiness is not the destination. Happiness is the way. And now you know the way home, take a deep breath and walk it.